Good. All right, good morning. I have the enviable job of standing between you and lunch. So we'll try to keep this thing moving. And what I want to talk a little bit this morning about is some of the cultivar trials that I ran in Ohio over. These are primarily 2012, 13, and 14 numbers. So we'll talk a little bit about why we set up those. I'm a little bit. Personally, I have some trepidation about just throwing a lot of numbers at you for variety trials, right? Because, well, these were done in Ohio, and you live really all over the country and parts of the hemisphere, right? So I don't want you to look at yield numbers and say, well, I'm definitely going to be able to get that. What I'm hoping to kind of share with you is a little bit about just some notes on the cultivars. Does this tend to be more vigorous? What about the fruit? What's the shape? What's the size? And those kinds of things. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the yields that we saw. But what I'm hoping that we can get across is just a little bit of the options that are out there. And as Rick mentioned, it's an industry that's constantly changing. And the thing about being this little guy, which many of us in this room fall in that category as far as size of production operations, is that the cultivars that are available for greenhouse production don't necessarily depend upon 100 people buying 1,000 seeds, right? So they depend upon the many acre operations. And so sometimes things that we're pretty familiar with end up not sticking around for the whole length of our production. So those are the things that we will always want to keep in mind. And so we're going to talk some about tomato cultivars. I'm sure that's maybe what you're the most interested in. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the big categories of leafy crop productions and considerations for growing these in your own greenhouse. So just some perspectives to kind of tell you where these numbers are coming from, what they look like, to give you a little bit of a sense for interpretation. So these are done in Ohio, and we're talking about January seeded, February transplanted, generally April bearing, and then into the late fall as far as yield. So these were not grown in a real big house. So we're talking about 10-foot sidewalls, double poly house, and most of the harvesting, pretty much all of these yield numbers, I took myself, right? So we don't have acres and acres of greenhouse. This is small plot trials that are really designed to give us a sense of generally how the plant behaves and fruit characteristics. So we've got some very diverse markets, and you guys know because you represent those diverse markets. So maybe they're cherry tomatoes for a school lunch system, or maybe they're beefsteaks for a farmer's market, right? So very diverse system, and these were intended really not to be published. So these weren't intended to go into papers, but to just be used in conversations and directly in grower support. So with that introduction, then I also kind of want to say, as you think about where you're getting your information and how you're making your trial and cultivar decisions, always keep some of these things in mind. Where was the trial done and who was the target audience for it? So if you're talking to your DeRuyter sales rep and they're talking about, well, we ran this cultivar and these trials, and it's very possible, right, that those cultivar trials were done in a 20-foot sidewall glass house. Right, so you want to keep that. In mind. Know if it was, in a British Columbia market or an Ontario market, or somewhere in the South. So think about the conditions under which those crops were tested, so that you really have a background sense of how much they might actually be useful in your operation. Were they grown in coconut coir, or was it in a perlite or rock wool system? How similar is it to the production system that you're using in your house? How were they managed? And of course, and this is particularly appropriate for our audience, and one of the reasons that I want to be cautious with throwing numbers at you is the fact that location and season make a huge amount of difference, right? If I'm planting in the spring, I'm going increasing day length, increasing light. for my young plants. If you're growing down here, you're really operating in opposite conditions. So you're taking your young plants into a decreasing light level. So that makes a difference. Makes a difference in yield. It makes a difference in cultivar. Makes a difference in everything. So we want to use caution in extrapolating data and thinking, well, I'm going to be able to duplicate that in my house. So what I would say is think about the numbers that you're looking at, thinking about what you're reading as far as the general characteristics of the plant, and consider how you might be able to use that in some of your own in-house trialing, because what works well for other people may not always work well for you. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the beefsteak cultivars that I've grown the most, and certainly if you want to chime in, we can be pretty low-key about this. This is definitely not an exhaustive list. There are a lot out there, and so when we're running cultivar trials, the challenge is always, well, I want a critical mass, but I also want to get a reasonable picture of what the options are that are out there. So what I spent the most greenhouse space in growing, and this was not a huge space, so a 22 by 72 greenhouse. I spent the majority of that space growing the larger beefsteaks. Those are what we had the most people starting in production with. So I'm going to give you some numbers from 2014, and this is not a whole season. I happen to have moved to Tennessee, so I'm giving you the front part of the season. And what I really want to tell you about is some of the characteristics of the fruit and of the plant. So over the course of that entire season, we got just over a half pound for fruit average, which is very much what you would see described in the literature on Geronimo. So we're talking about an older cultivar that's been in production for a while. I was reading a website the other day that was like, one of our most promising cultivars for 2003 was Geronimo. So we're talking about something that's been in production for 12 to 14 years. And pretty good number of fruit per plant. So we're talking about, and you may have grown some of these yourself, so sometimes we'll see them get a little bit pointed in the season. You may have seen some white core. In my personal experience, I think I saw maybe a little bit more russeting on Geronimo than I did on some of the newer ones. So there are going to be some nuances there to think about. We don't know exactly how much longer this cultivar is going to be available. It tends to be grown more often by some of the smaller growers. One of the newer cultivars, which in conversations with folks, I feel like is one of the more polarizing cultivars. It seems like people have had pretty good experience with it. They like it because it hits their market, or they've been rather frustrated by it. So a fairly vegetative cultivar, so we're talking about pretty vigorous growth and really balancing this plant, right? Being able to steer it so that we can, of course, get good fruit production and not have the vigor of the plant overwhelm us, right? So you want to think about those types of things when you're thinking about the season in which you're going into. So if you take a very vegetative plant into a lower light time of year, it's going to be a little bit harder to keep that balance. So I saw a little bit more fruit per plant, similar average over the course of the season. They did get a little bit smaller in our house in the summertime. Biggest difference here, shorter tomato, right? So it's not as deep, and we're going to see more ribs on this tomato. I work with some growers who sold this in a similar bin with their heirloom tomatoes. So, right, productive F1 hybrid, but it was actually bred for the French markets, but it has a much different visual appearance. Now, if you're selling it to an upscale hamburger place and they want a whole lot of slices, this is probably not your tomato. One of the newer cultivars that we've kind of been looking at, maybe this is a possible replacement for Geronimo, those types of things. So we're talking about a pretty vigorous cultivar. I grew this in 13. Real small plots, just a few. And it was the highest yielder that we saw that year. And those happened to be because of the size of the greenhouse, right? So those were side rows, higher light. So this is a plant that's really bred grown most in glass houses, and bred for higher light conditions. So pretty large fruit. You can see in my trials I didn't get quite as many fruit per plant, almost the same yield per plant, but especially early in the season, some pretty large fruit. So this is a deeper fruit, much deeper than the Rebelski or the 7749. Maybe not quite as deep red, almost a little bit of a pink color often when it's picked. For Rebelski and for Ferranti, some powdery mildew resistance. So we're not talking about bulletproof powdery mildew resistance. These are both listed as intermediate resistance, but in the houses that I have seen these growing, it's definitely noticeable. You can pick out what your resistant and what your non-powder resistant cultivars are. There's very much pressure in the house, but it turns out that linked with that powdery mildew resistance, there's a little bit of a sensitivity to low light, so you've seen some leaf necrosis in low light conditions. So I want to think about those factors, and it seems like there are probably more people who are growing Torero than Ferranti in some of the northern markets that I tend to hear from and talk to the most. So this is just a slide that gives you a little sense of the yield through time. So across 40 different pickings, right? So this is more than 20 weeks worth of yield data on that same season, and I told you some of the average weights. Just looking at those three cultivars and seeing, do we flatten off a little bit in the summertime? Do we still maintain that yield trajectory? Was there a cultivar that stood out as far as early yield that tapered off later in the season? And so these go to early to mid-October, so we're not all the way through the end of the season. But in general, what we saw is that the early trends tended to stay with it. So Rebelski Geronimo, just slightly more average yield per plant than Ferranti in the trials that I ran. I wanted to throw this slide in here, certainly not as a be-all, end-all on this topic, but just to tell you a little bit about what I had seen. And these are 2014 numbers. They correspond directly to that last slide you saw. But I have run a couple of years worth of grafting trials in the greenhouse with some of these most common cultivars. We were talking about this in the hall a little bit ago, and so I always want to say this with a caveat to southern growers. Grafting, of course, can provide us the vigor of a very vigorous rootstock. It can sometimes create the opportunity that we can maybe get a little bit longer harvest season out of our crops. In Ohio, I did not really see a yield benefit of using Maxiport, which is one of the common rootstocks. But that does not mean that would be true in southern areas. So, I'm certainly curious for the smaller folks who have used grafting in their plastic houses, right? So, and I also think that we may not be, and certainly this may have been true in this house, right? We weren't creating the conditions that really allowed us to take advantage of the power, right, of the vigor of these rootstocks. Maybe we didn't have quite high enough light levels to really take advantage of the genetics that were there. And it may be the growing in a southern system where your end of the crop is going to be, May, June, higher light conditions. This may be different. Or maybe if you have some root-borne disease challenges and those types of things, you may be able to see a benefit there. So that's my really short note on grafting. I think we still have a lot to learn and some gains to take advantage of there, because in the very large houses, almost everything is on a grafted stock. So Torero is probably one of the most common cultivars that you have been seeing and reading about and thinking about. So it is a little bit more generative, right? So a little bit more focused on fruit production versus those more vigorous, Ferranti and definitely Rebelski, which may be an advantage in the southern growing season. It does not have powdery mildew resistance. Many times I feel like the feedback that I've heard on Torero, a lot of it depends on if there were disease pressures in the house. It seems like, and I can say this, in trials that I've run too. Powdery mildew is something that you battle in your tomato house. You may not be thrilled with Torero, but if it is not, it seems like we've had folks who have certainly had a lot of success with it. So there's a lot of large-scale commercial production in Torero right now. So we're talking about a pretty large fruit, especially early in the season and on those highlight areas of the house, deeper, kind of similar to Ferranti fruit in size and shape, maybe, but a little bit more red, not quite the pink color. So that's just, this is probably one that you'll want to think about. It's recommended for long crops that this be grafted, but certainly there are a lot of folks growing this ungrafted. Big Dina common cultivar that I actually haven't grown as much, just small plots, and so you can see size-wise and fruit, shape, color, it's been similar to some of those other cultivars. I'm sure there are probably folks in the audience who've grown a lot more Big Dina than I have. I've tried a Richwan cultivar, Guyana, which seems to be consisting of a little bit smaller fruit, almost just a little bit larger than a cluster. So if you don't need, that really large 8 to 10, sometimes even 12-ounce fruit, I think there may not be quite as many options on that smaller fruited scale. Now, I haven't talked a lot about some of the older cultivars. Rhapsody, Trust would be a couple examples. So some of these tend to be a little bit thinner skin, right? Not as firm. So of course, when I was talking about, say, Torero, for example, we're talking about tomato that's grown a lot in the, say, Ontario production sector. And so they're packing them up in boxes. They're going to grocery stores all over the place. It tends to be a little bit firmer tomato. I mean, they're picking them right, of course, but they are still shipping those. So these older cultivars, maybe not as good shippers, not used as much in those larger operations, and the availability is uncertain. So I think that a lot of the things that you want to be thinking about is, if I'm growing one of these older ones, what is coming? How can I be prepared for what comes next? Another option that I don't know how many of you all are growing are colored beets. So there's not a ton of choices in this area. Now, we're not talking about heirlooms, right? So these are productive F1 hybrids, maybe not quite the yield as you get out of one of the general red beefsteaks, but pretty good yielding cultivars, pretty similar fruit size. When I was working in Ohio, I usually take a day or two a year and go up to Ontario and look at the trials and the seed companies, and we visit, we talk, yields and what they're seeing and what we're seeing, and I would always say, hey, people seem to like this bee orange. If you've been growing for a while, you know that a couple years ago we were really out of bee orange, and it was a whole market challenge to figure out what else to grow. It became a pretty high commodity seed. So I was like, what's coming down the pipeline? And it seems like maybe there's not a ton coming down the pipeline. So we're not talking about as many options in the yellow beets. But if you want something that looks similar to some of your regular beefsteak reds, this is an option. I didn't run a lot of cluster trials, so I'll just give a couple comments on two of the most common cluster vine-on tomatoes, TOV, tomato on vine. So broadly, these are both the Reuter cultivars. Comet, or Comet, as we West Virginians would generally say, is kind of your general easy keeper, right? So it's a little bit more climatically adaptable as far as light conditions. It does not have powdery mildew resistance. Release was really bred more high light environments. So I know even growing in Ohio, we generally saw some differences between fruit size early in the season when we got right into the mid-season, but it does have powdery mildew resistance. And I think we're probably getting some other options coming down the pipe that sort of break the difference here, that still have some powdery mildew resistance, but probably aren't as sensitive to light conditions as Release. These next few pictures are really not to give you a lot of yield data or anything. I just want to blow through some pictures and kind of show you what some of the options are as far as the full range of specialty tomatoes out there. A lot of like pictures of hands and things in them. These were mostly for my own record keeping, and so I am not a studio photographer, but hopefully it'll give you a sense for generally what the fruit looks like. So Roma tomatoes. Of course, we think of Roma tomatoes as a field processing tomato, right? So determinate tomatoes, all picked once, but these are traditional greenhouse indeterminate tomatoes, and for some people, we've had some requests and discussions about that. It still seems like it's a pretty low percentage of folks growing these crops. If you have a market where you can get the yield necessary, the price necessary, you're not going to be able to compete with field produce by any means. And so here's just a couple different variations in fruit shape. Prunus is a de Ruyter variety, pretty productive. I believe it does have powder and mildew resistance. Ithaca, another one that tends to maybe be a little bit less prone to blossom end rot, which tends to be a little bit more prevalent in these smaller fruited Roma tomatoes. These are long plants. So that's one of the challenges, and of course, in Cody, we were growing in a 10-foot house, right? Not huge. And so we had trouble just finding enough room, right, to keep our ripening clusters clean and off the floor, which was not so much the case with our, Bronte, Geronimo beefsteak. So these are long plants. Here's just a couple kind of in the cherry grape category. So you have every sort of fruit shape that you could possibly imagine. Dashers would be an example of a grape with just a little bit of indentation sometimes on the bottom, so just this little dimple. And then, of course, Cito is a Rick Schwan cultivar, which is traditionally called like a mini plum, right? So you have a lot more distinct shape and really everything in between. Then, of course, you have your completely round completely smooth fruited grape tomatoes of a whole range of sizes. And I mostly focused on reds. I didn't grow a lot of yellow grape tomatoes. But here's just a couple examples of 603 and Rich 172, 162. I think the battery just died. But can you still hear me? All right. Okay. So I will just keep talking, and so the biggest difference here is fruit size. So I'll show you some numbers when we get a couple more slides over of plant number and the fruit weight of these, so you can kind of see a little bit of difference. And then in the regular cherry range, one of the most common, and probably my favorite as far as color, quality, and bricks, or sugar content, 564, and it was one of our higher yielding cherries as well. Zabrino, I don't know if you guys have grown this. I would say it's a cool fruit shape. Not one of the best tasting tomatoes that I've ever grown. So be careful sometimes when you get into the novelty fruits that you're still getting a good tasting tomato, not just visually interesting. So this is just a chart from the same season. So this is about 3/4 of a season, but looking at the number of fruit per plant and the fruit size. So we're talking about our Roma tomatoes, which not directly comparable because they weren't in the same tribe, but we're getting close to the yields of the clusters, and some of the lower end of the beefsteak. So they were by weight per plant pretty productive. And then we start looking at our really small fruited cultivars. We were getting way more fruit per plant, right? But at the time that I quit taking yield data, 3/4 of the way through the season, that may have only had 12 or 15 pounds per plant on some of these. Now, I'm not saying you can't get more in your production system, because in the house that we were growing in, we did not have an unlimited number of feed systems, right? So we could feed different volumes for some of our smaller fruited tomatoes, but we couldn't adjust our fertilizer recipe. So that's just a little bit of a side note on these. General trend being that the larger your fruit, right, the higher total pounds per plant you're going to get. And that's one of the reasons that, I like the 564, right? You get a good tasting cherry tomato, but you're also not sacrificing as much in yield as you are on some of the most small fruited cultivars. And so this is just that same graph that really shows that some of those medium to lower yielding cultivars, some of our grapes and some of our cherries really did slow down in the summertime, while our aromas tended to maintain a pretty good yield trajectory. So I think that hopefully that gave you a little bit of an overview of some of the cultivar choices that are out there. But when it comes right down to it, some of the most important things for you to think about in cultivar trials is, well, what would this look like in my house? How could I use this information? And so I would hope that even if you have a main cultivar that your customers like and that provides a good portion of your sales, you're still thinking about what some of your other options are, whether there's a seed shortage or whether something that's a little bit higher yielding comes along. So the question is, can you very successfully trial a new cultivar or something in the house with some of your current cultivars? And you want to be really careful about the tendencies of the crop, right? So its character. And I tried to mention a little bit of that when I was talking about the different cultivars. But say if you're growing truss right now, and that's what your whole greenhouse is, and you have one feed system, it's going to be really hard to get a feel for what Grabowski might do for you, because the way that you manage those is going to be quite a bit different. You can't just put a little piece of a new cultivar in another row of tomatoes because they may get completely overrun throughout the course of the season. So you want to only trial things that act in a broadly similar way, or you're not going to get a good sense of what those cultivars can really do. Or, best case scenario, you have a system where you can manage them a little bit differently. So it comes to fertilization, formulation, feeding, rate, frequency, all those sorts of things. Is there a difference in the disease package? Will it require more space and time, right? So some of our more generative cultivars tend to be a little bit more forgiving as far as how fast you're going to need to remove weeds and maybe even leaning lower, some of those types of things. And of course, customer preferences. So we never want to have a huge trial area, something that it turns out people didn't like as well as we thought they would. So, so this is my personal analogy for this situation. When I was, my very first car was a Chevrolet Corsica. I don't know if you ever had the pleasure of having one of those cars, but it was not GM's finest engineering moment. Those crummy cars from the mid-90s. And so that's what I drove around in college. And I had some misfire problems, and it smelled bad, right? But it died eventually, and I bought a Volkswagen Jetta, which I'm still driving, by the way. And I remember one week, soon after I got that, I'm driving through town with some of my friends in the back seat. They never rode with me before because my old car was pretty stinky. And so this was the first time they'd really ridden with me very much. And we were cautiously driving through town. And one of my buddies in the back seat, he had a Jetta too, and he was like, "What are you doing? Hit the gas and take advantage of some of this fine German engineering." And so that's my analogy for tomato management. We can choose the best cultivars, right, that are out there. Some of the most productive cultivars that are available. This may be Dutch engineering in this tomato analogy, while my car was German made. But if we don't manage our fertilizer appropriately, if we have humidity, light conditions in our greenhouse that don't allow us to take advantage of those genetic abilities of our crop, then it's not going to be a magic bullet for us. And so the way that we manage our crop, the way that we manage our environment is, in the end, the steering, right? Is what's going to allow us to take advantage of the genetics. So switching cultivars is not a guarantee. It's really all about our management and our skill in production. So in the just few minutes that I have left, I kind of want to give you just a brief snapshot of some of your main leafy crop cultivar options. So, the bibs, the remains, the oak leaf, and the lowell, some of the leaf lettuces. So here we go. You've probably heard the most about the bib, right? So this is kind of our glass house lettuce, very much bred for greenhouse conditions. Some of the most common cultivars that we go, Flandria probably. Italia is really more of a summer lawn. In the trials that I ran, I tended to see similar yields. Rex, kind of the old standard, which you've probably heard the most about. We went through some time when Rex seed was a little bit hard to get, so a lot of my trials I tended to run with Flandria sort of as my industry control. Gardy was a cultivar that we didn't currently sell, but I did get some encouraging yield numbers on it. And so one of the main things to think about when you're selecting cultivars is their consistency over the course of a season. So if you're talking about one of the large European growers, lots of times they're slotting their lettuce. Actually, just like an iceberg grower would in California. Sometimes we don't do quite as much of that in the smaller grower in the United States. And so what we're really looking for is an all-around performer. So we want something that tends to yield well in summer higher light conditions and doesn't drop off too much in our fall to winter lower light conditions. And so I just put these numbers up here to show you that, Flandria was one of our more consistent performers from trial to trial. So these are 3 consecutive yield trials. And so say, 150 grams is about a 5-ounce head of lettuce, depending on what you're selling at. So that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of what we're looking at here. I did tend to see a little bit higher yield numbers here on Gardia, so an interesting cultivar to maybe give a look. One other thing that I worked on some, and this is something that we talk about instituting potential new growing practices, right? Anytime you try anything in our tomatoes, it's a challenge, right? It's a long crop. It's hard to know if we really made any difference, but I think that looking at some different medias in leafy crop production may be a not terribly overwhelming, right? A not terribly high-risk way to see if there's some ways that we can introduce some gains. So some of the trials that I ran were looking at our traditional rock wool growing cubes with some of our polymers, our plastic, so our foams, and also some peat or core products. And if this is something that works with your management system, right? So these peat and core products are they're more like a plug tray, right? So you actually have a tray, where we don't with our Oasis or rock wool products, but solid tendency to see a little bit higher yield with some of those organic media. And if you have maybe some challenges with some of your pH management and those types of things, sometimes there may be a little bit more buffer capacity in the organics. So that's just something to think about, some not terribly challenging ways to look at your system. I didn't throw in any yield numbers here on the reds. Theodore is it's listed as a winter bib, so you want to be careful with the fact that it tends to tip burn pretty easily in higher light conditions. I ran it in some lighting trials, and those long days with lights just didn't do anything good for the Theodore. I apologize for the quality of the Skypost picture. I swear that you can get some beautiful Skypost heads of lettuce, and that is a little bit in a winter season, so you're not seeing the beautiful, brilliant red color. But this is just a little bit of some not quite mature Flandria and Theodore together, so you can kind of see that they pair well. You have matching colors is kind of what you're going for. Speaking of matching colors and pairing, I'll throw up some pictures of Salanova, which is actually bred and developed by the same company that does Theodore and Flandria and those kinds of cultivars, and it's really developed as a box set, right? So you can match these guys and send out a sampler pack that has red bibs and green bibs and red oaks, and they have a lot of crisps, and there are all kinds of different Salanovas that you can choose from. What I found was that my greens tended to outweigh my yield on the red, and this is a pretty expensive seed. So, this is a high-value farmer's market product or something like that. It's, visually they're beautiful. They are intended to have one centered cut, which provides leaves of very similar sizes. So rather than you think of a traditional bib that we might cut into, and we would have some that are curled in the center, some that are more open on the outside, this is intended to be a similar size leaf all the way through. So some of your specialty customers, it might be an idea. One cultivar that I didn't really get enough data on due to low light conditions in my system was Santoro, so I'll throw that out there. We didn't tend to get as good a luck with some of the slightly more open bib heads, and that was more due to Ohio conditions. So I tended to see some tip burn and some issues with a couple of these cultivars, Milana too. So that's a summer crisp. And one thing that we saw in our trials, which just always keep in the back of your mind, especially if you think fall and winter, is that you can get a wide range of bib lettuce cultivars, but many of those that are bred for outdoor production tend to be a little bit wider, right? So a little bit larger frame, and so they may not, especially in the mid to low light seasons. And Nancy is an example of great outdoor Boston, right? But it may not fit well in your system. So here's a couple of slides of a Lola lettuce. So we're talking about really frilly, right? So deeply in size. And this is a summertime crop, single seed in a cube. And oftentimes these aren't going to gain quite as quick as your bibs. And so a couple of seeds per cube might be a good way to get your yield up there on these in a similar time period, depending upon the season. So just a couple of notes in my trials, and this is with the Ohio caveats, right? That they typically ran a little bit lighter in weight for similar time period than bibs. And so there's an example. Over a 6-week trial, we were getting a 6.5 ounce head of Flandria, but a little under 5 on Lozano, which was those green bulbs that you saw in that last picture. And the red's often a little bit lighter than that. The plant's spending some of its energy, its sugars into that red pigment. And then of course, and Steve mentioned this earlier, and they can tell you what some of their favorite cultivars are, I'm sure, but some of the more leaf lettuces, like Green Star or 2-Star, there are some of those good opportunities for greenhouse production that can fit really well with some of our markets and be a pretty fast-growing head of lettuce. Some of my favorites to grow are the oak leaf. I have generally not really seen much tip burn issue on some of these, so I tend to think that they're kind of easy keepers, a good range of leaf colors. So I'm showing you a green, and that's kind of a medium red. And you can also get much deeper reds. And so, once again, with these crops, when you tend to get some of the more deeply pigmented cultivars, which especially show up under higher light levels, then it does tend to reduce their weight a little bit. So you may need a little bit longer in there to get an evenly sized green and red head of oak leaf. So here we're talking about a regular green. Here is kind of a medium red, and this was our deepest red cultivar. So this is something just to keep in the back of your mind. Your reds may not weigh out as heavy as some of your greens. I'm not going to show you any romaine numbers. I can honestly say that I don't consider myself to have really achieved excellence in romaine production. But I can say that especially in the part of the country where we are right now, you may have definitely some seasonal challenges. And one thing that I would say is, in talking with new growers, it seems like greenhouse romaine is fabulous. Probably my favorite thing to take home and eat from the greenhouse. And it seems like sometimes it's easier to sell than it is to evenly produce throughout the entire season. So I would be careful not to oversell your romaine, because if you have a great fall or spring romaine, you may be able to build up your market to the point where you're not able to keep them well fed in beautiful open green heads of romaine. So here are some not real heavy heads of greenhouse romaine, but to kind of show you that we tend to have a very green leaf all the way through. We're not going to really head up real tight. Salvias, Helvias, a couple of common romaines, but
there are certainly other options. Some even field cultivars like green forest, coastal star. So there are several options there. The mixed, of course, I don't have any yield numbers to show you on mixed cubes. You're probably relieved, right? No more tables. But it's certainly an area for a lot of different growers. And so sometimes you're seeding raw, right? Just a pinch of seed. There is such a thing as a multi-seed pellet. I think they're a little bit expensive right now for most of the production systems, but you can get lettuce mixtures as well as there's pak choy and kale and mizuna and mustard in there. So certainly, depending upon the way that you want to tailor your crop to your markets, there's all kinds of opportunities. And we're right on our lunchtime hour right now. So there are certainly many other more minor crops depending upon your market. Many of these we don't have as much greenhouse cultivars bred for these systems, so we're sort of trialing ones that work well in soil systems and seeing if they work well in our soil-less systems. But the time's coming when more and more choices as our market becomes even more stronger and differentiated. So that's what I've got for you today. Certainly, I think that hopefully we can give you a little bit of sense of what trial data looks like and how it can be useful for you. But grain of salt, get experience with it in your own house before you make any wholesale changes. You can eat. Right? Yeah. Let's go downstairs.